The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Weaver, and on behalf of Advancing Evidence-Based Practice, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on Blueprints, Standards, and Issues in Identifying Blueprints Programs. We have Elliott and David Hawkins here today giving us a repeat of a popular Blueprints workshop presented at this year's Blueprints Conference. Elliott is the Director of the Program on Problem Behavior and the founding director of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence in the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado. He directed the National Youth Survey, the longest study in the U.S. of delinquency, drug use, and antisocial and violent behavior in young adults. Del's written many books, and he's the founder and principal investigator for the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development Initiative. He's also a past president and fellow of the American Society of Criminology. David Hawkins is the endowed professor of prevention and founding director of the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington School of Social Work. Dr. Hawkins is a current member of both the IOM NRC Board on Children, Youth, and Families and the Forum on Promoting Children's Cognitive, Affective, and Behavioral Health. He's a current member of the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development and Advisory Board and a past president of the Society for Prevention Research. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Del and David. Del, we will now turn the time over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, I hope my screen is up.
It looks good.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for attending and for your interest in Blueprint programs. We have two goals today. One is to familiarize you with the Blueprints process and the standard that Blueprints uses. And secondly, to discuss some of the problems that we encounter on the advisory board applying that standard to reviews of program evaluations in the hope that we can get better, more successful reviews from those people who are doing program evaluations. So let me start by describing the Blueprint targeted outcomes. You should see that up on the board. Originally, Blueprints was a way of certifying programs that were effective for violence, drug use, and delinquency prevention kind of programs, but we've expanded the set of outcomes that we look at and that we review programs for. So at this point, we continue to do problem behavior, and we're pretty much caught up with effective programs in those particular areas. In addition, now we've added educational skills and attainment, emotional well-being, physical health, and positive relationships with parents, peers, and adults. So what you see there on the screen are the targeted outcomes which we now focus on. So on the Blueprints website, you can find programs that are effective programs in all of those areas. The standard of evidence that we use for Blueprints really involves four areas. One, intervention specificity. Two, evaluation quality. Three, the intervention impact. And four, system readiness. So we look at all four of those criteria in deciding whether a program will be certified as a model program or a promising program. So first of all, looking at intervention specificity, first thing to know is that this criteria is one which is determined by the Blueprint program staff. That is, we look at the programs, we pretty much know all of the evaluations that are published at least for a given program, and we screen and look at those programs and make sure that they meet this standard. First of all, that there's clear program documentation about what the program is about, what its theoretical model is, what its change model is, or what's sometimes called the logic model is. We look to see what are the risk and protective factors which are identified, and we list those. So if you get on our website for a given program, you'll see what the targeted risk and protective factors are, as well as the theoretical logic model for that program. Then we look to make sure that the population is defined. That is the population for which this program has been determined to be effective, and then we look to make sure that it's one of the targeted blueprint outcomes that is a target for that particular intervention. For a model program, we look for a couple of additional things. One, we look to see if there are promising, if all the promising elements have been met. Then we look to see if there's a citation of the research base that supports the causal mechanisms that are involved. So there are two separate causal mechanisms involved in any intervention. One is a theoretical model which links the risk and protective factors to the outcome. And the second model is the way that you change that the program is designed to change those risk or protective factors. So we look at that as a couple of additional requirements for meeting this first standard, which is determined by our program staff. Then we go to the evaluation quality, and this is where the Blueprint Board gets involved. So the process involves an initial review by program staff. And that review is then examined and considered by myself and Sharon Mahalik and Fred Pample. And if it looks good to us at that point, then it goes on to the board. And the board then looks at this particular criteria, the evaluation quality. So in order to meet the criteria for promising on evaluation quality, we require either one high-quality randomized control trial or two high-quality quasi-experimental design studies. We also look to make sure that the population that is listed as a target population in the program description is the population for which this evaluation was conducted. We look to make sure that the intervention was clearly documented. That is, that they were implementing what they described themselves, what the program described as being their intervention, and again, that it's a blueprint outcome. To meet model status on this criteria, we require all of what's there for promising, but we require two high-quality randomized control trials or one randomized control trial and one high-quality quasi-experimental study. So the minimum for a model program involves two really good studies, one of which has to be a randomized controlled trial. The Blueprint Board recently added to our standard that we are looking for independence in at least one replication, which is a really critical issue because we know that when it's the developer who is doing all of the evaluations, that we get an effect size for the program typically, which is an elevated level effect size. When you take programs to scale and you have people other than the developer implementing the programs, we know that you typically get a smaller effect size. So we want to have both the developers work, but we also want to have at least one independent randomized controlled trial or good quality quasi-experimental study. And if you meet that standard, then we now are calling those programs Model Plus programs. And then we require that the evaluations show that the effect is sustained for at least 12 months. In many cases, we're looking at evidence for sustainability that go for 10 years or more. But in any case, you have to at least show sustainability in one of those trials for at least 12 months. In addition, we look for fidelity impact assessment and whether there's a dose response analysis, whether there are subgroup analyses, whether there's a mediation effect analysis. But those things which are in lighter color, in that blue color on the slide, are not required. They are things which, if we see those things and they're consistent, then it really gives us a lot more confidence that there is a causal connection there, that the change in the risk and protective factors is what accounts for the change in the outcome. So that if we have that additional kind of information, that gives us a lot of confidence in the program really having the effect that we have determined in that particular analysis. but we only require the model program having 2 good quality studies, that the effect is sustained for at least 12 months, and that there are no iatrogenic effects. Any questions? And I'm happy to take questions as we go along. So if questions come up, go ahead and ask them, and we'll try to answer them as we go.
Yes, we have a couple. The first one, great. The first one is, does Blueprints only review peer-reviewed studies, or does it consider unpublished manuscripts? And has that ever made a difference in the outcome of the designation a program received?
That's a great question. For the most part, we are looking at published work, and this will come up later in the presentation, but we do a search of all of the journals that present evaluations on targeted outcomes for the program, and so we got a pretty comprehensive review process for things which are published. We do consider reports which are made to the government or to funding agencies, and we do consider things which have been accepted for publication and haven't been published in other papers, but that typically happens after we've started to look at a program and we've contacted the developer and asked if there are other kinds, other evaluations which are available. So in the initial process of searching for programs, we don't search unpublished work. So the bulk of what we get really is published work. And to be honest, I have no idea whether that's ever made a difference. David, do you think we've ever had changed our opinion on an evaluation or on a program's work based upon getting some unpublished work?
I can't remember that, except that I do think that we do look seriously at reports to government funding agencies that are often not published publications, but if they're a final report of a project, and often the things that we look at are final reports of projects that may not have been published in peer-reviewed press. So we don't require peer review in order to review something. But I can't say that I can remember specific places where things were changed, although I wouldn't be surprised, because we do look at not publications, but reports to funding agencies of projects that have not been published.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I remember at the last board meeting we did look at a paper which was reviewing all of the research on a specific program which wasn't yet published, and that did, I think, affect the way that we considered the evaluation evidence for that program. So I do think that you know, work which is good quality work, which involves reports submitted to funding agencies, is something that we do see fairly regularly, but it's not a part really of the initial search that we do for programs.
Okay.
Another question?
Yes, we do have more. And David, if you could speak up just a little, that would be great. Another question is it required to have the intent to treat population in the research evaluation for either promising or model status, or is that considered a fatal flaw?
I guess I don't say the question to me again. I didn't pick up on that.
Sure. Is it required to have the intent to treat population in the research evaluation for either promising or model status, or is that considered a fatal flaw?
Yeah, we do require an intent to treat type of analysis, which means that the way that the control and experimental group or comparison group were randomized or assigned, then the analysis has to follow all of those, or at least make an attempt to follow all of those which were assigned to one of those two treatment conditions. So the failure to do an intent to treat analysis does constitute for us, in most instances, a fatal flaw.
Okay. And how is fidelity of impact assessed?
The fidelity of impact is something which we like to see, but to be very honest, it's fairly rare. And the fidelity really requires that there be a separate way of evaluating whether the program was delivered the way it was intended or described in the program model. Very often that's not done in evaluations. It's one of the things we would love to see done more frequently so that we could determine how the effect size varies by the level of fidelity in the implementation. So we look for it. We don't require it, but we look for it. It helps us, I think, to build greater confidence in the quality of the evidence for a program.
Okay, we have another question. How do you interpret a finding in which the experimental intervention is tested against a strong bona fide intervention, but both show strong pre-post effects on main outcomes?
Yeah, that's an important consideration. We're looking at the difference between absolute effect and a marginal effect. So we do look at both of those things so that it may very well be that an intervention will not appear to be better than some comparison intervention or treatment as usual. And you have to be careful about how you interpret that, because the interpretation is that the intervention that we're considering may not be any better than treatment as usual, and that would be a fair conclusion. On the other hand, it would not be an appropriate conclusion to say that that intervention wasn't effective. So the way that you interpret that particular kind of outcome differs. Typically what we're looking for are programs which provide for some improvement over treatment as usual. So, there are just different ways of interpreting outcomes based upon that kind of distinction.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions for now. So go ahead.
All right, we're off on to intervention impact.
Oh, another question. Just got another question. Do you want to take it?
Let's go.
Sorry about that. Just came across my screen. Do you have any thoughts about how to get funding agencies to align to these standards? For example, funding replication studies?
I'm encouraged by the fact that we are seeing some of that, but the question, I think, does highlight the fact that funding agencies are often not interested in funding replication. We have this whole move towards innovation and the need, or at least from a funder's perspective, looking for new kinds of interventions. And that's really, from my perspective at least, very unfortunate. One of the big problems we have is that so many of the programs out there that we're looking at have a single evaluation. And if you don't have a replication, it's very, very difficult to meet the blueprint standard. So you can, if you have a single randomized controlled trial, meet the promising standard, but you can't meet the model standard with a single study. And if you don't have a randomized controlled trial, you can't even meet promising with a single study. So the need for replication is great. And we see some of that by funding agencies, but I would really like to see a lot more. David, do you have any comment on that?
I think you really put it well. The problem that I see in maybe NIH reviews is that there is credit given for innovation. In fact, there's one of the review criteria is innovation, and yet replication we know is the hallmark of science, and we don't give credit for replication. And I think it's a major problem that we really all need to be attending to, because this emphasis on innovation at the expense of replication is, I think, having deleterious effects on our ability to really move evidence-based programs forward through this designation as a model program, because we've had replication, and that's what's required for model designation, as Del said.
And there's a follow-up on that fatal flaw question, which is, he's saying he was more considering that the intent to treat population were those participants that began the intervention but then dropped out of the program prior to completion. Do those need to have an analysis included in research?
Yeah, there are a couple ways that can be handled. That is, we're not saying that the program can't deal with any attrition. Obviously, that would not be a realistic expectation. So the point is that the write-up of the evaluation demonstrates that there was an attempt to obtain the post-test measures on everybody that was initially in the intervention. And if there is attrition, that there's attention to the attrition in a couple of ways. One, there are ways of getting estimates for those that have dropped out, missing data kinds of approaches so that they're still represented in the analysis, or at least we know that there is an analysis to see if the loss rate was different between the two conditions, because that's where it becomes critical. So if there's attrition in the study, we look to make sure that that attrition wasn't differential across those two conditions, because if it is, that can explain the difference in the outcomes that might be reported.
Okay, do you want to know that we have more questions, or do you want to move on and save them till the end?
Yeah, I think maybe we should save them now, and there'll be time at the end where we really wanted to leave some time at the end. So, but I think maybe it'd be helpful if I got through the next 3 or 4 slides, and then we could take questions before we go to David's presentation. Okay,
sounds good.
Okay, so we're looking at intervention impact, which is also something which the Blueprint Board makes a decision on. So for promising, we require a significant positive effect on one of our Blueprint outcomes, and we look to make sure that there is a significant effect size that's associated with that effect. And we also look for iatrogenic effects. And if we see iatrogenic effects, in most cases, that constitutes a fatal flaw. For model, we require that it means that the promising standard be met. And then we require that that effect be evidence for that effect be for a 1 year or 12 months sustained impact. And because we are now getting evaluations which involve 5 or 6 or 7 different evaluation outcomes, different studies, we look for the predominance of a positive effect across the evaluations. So that means that it isn't necessarily the case that all of the evaluations are showing positive effect on a given outcome. So if there are 4 studies and 3 of them are showing positive effects and 1 is not, we would still consider that as a positive effect across the evaluations. And then again, we look for a positive dose response analysis or mediation effect analysis. Those are not required, but again, they build confidence in the evaluation outcome. System readiness then is the final criteria that we use, and this is something that the staff works out with the developer, in which we want to determine whether the program is really ready to go to scale. That is it ready that it can be disseminated on a reasonably wide scale? Back when we were doing one of our first tests of Blueprint programs funded by OJJDP, in which we were funded to put 10 of each of our original 10 Blueprint programs into the field, we discovered that there were only 4 of those 10 programs that were even capable of doing that. That is, they weren't ready. They didn't have the kinds of materials, the protocols, the training, and all of that available to be able to put programs into the field. We've also learned that of those original 10 Blueprint programs we have, 4 of them, I think 4 of them are no longer available. That is, if you were to contact the developer, you would discover that the developer is no longer involved in it, or the developer has passed away, and that there's nobody that's essentially promoting that program any longer. So for the Blueprints list on the website, if the program's on that list, we are essentially certifying that that program is ready to be distributed and to be disseminated. So for promising, this requires that an explicit process for reaching the targeted population is available, that training materials and protocols are available, that there's a program manual, that the financial resources that are required are there and listed, that the human resources required for that program are available, and that the program is still available for dissemination. To meet the model standard, we want some evidence that that program has been fairly widely disseminated and that it's been tested in real-world settings. That means we're beyond just looking at efficacy trial and looking at some effectiveness trials, and that there is technical assistance available, and that there is a measure of fidelity for that program so that those who are implementing the program can actually look at a fidelity checklist, and that helps in the evaluations, further evaluations of that program, because you've got a way now of evaluating the fidelity of that program. Okay, one more slide here. And looking at the overall program rating, so to be promising, you must meet the promising standard on all 4 of those criteria. For model, you must have either 2 randomized controlled trials or 1 randomized trial and 1 quasi-experimental study. Must have significant positive effects, must show sustainability of 12 months on at least 1 outcome, no iatrogenic effects, and to meet the Model Plus standard, you also have to have an independent replication. Okay, so just a real summary of this. The blueprint review process is a systematic review process. We have an inclusive search for studies, and that's really critical so that we reduce the potential for bias. A number of agencies which have lists that provide certification of programs do not look for all of the programs all of the program evaluations that are available. They take 2 or 3 and they base their decision on that. The Blueprints Board looks at all of the evaluations that we can find for a given program. We do have explicit eligibility criteria. The studies are screened by these criteria, and the review looks at all of those studies. It's a quantitative review with pre-established guidelines and rules. When we have more than 3 evaluations to look at, we do a meta-analysis, and we do a detailed write-up of the review and a decision made by the Blueprints Board. So that's essentially what the Campbell collaboration describes as a systematic review process, and we're essentially committed to that process. Okay, any questions for this part before we turn to David and looking at some of the issues that we see as we've evaluated these kind of program reviews?
Yes, Del, we do have a few questions, and we're going to take time for those and give David some time. He's going to try to call in. Apparently we're having some audio problems and attendees are having a hard time hearing him. So we'll take these questions right now. And David, if you can go ahead and call in that number I sent you and see if they can help you switch over to the phone option. Does that sound good? Okay, so first question here is, how long after submission does it take Blueprints to evaluate the program, assuming all data is available for evaluation?
The Blueprint Board meets twice a year, and so in any given year we probably look at somewhere between, I would say, 15 and 25 programs. Some of these programs really have acquired a lot of evaluation evidence, so the actual number of program reviews that we look at can be quite high. We accept people that submit to us and say, we would like you to review our program. Here are the evaluations that have been done. And so if we get that, then we go through that first process. There's a write-up which is done by graduate students that we've trained, and then that's reviewed by our senior program staff. And if it looks good at that point, then it'll go to the next board meeting. So it's hard to say exactly how long it takes. We're constantly monitoring evaluations that are done, so it's not at all unusual that we may take a program to the Blueprint Board without the developer even knowing that we're looking at their program, because we've just picked it up based upon the publication results of evaluations for that program. We've looked at it, we've decided it's a good program, and we're taking it to the board for review, and the developer may not even know that. But from the point that we get a program and we get a write-up on it and we've approved it for approval for taking to the board, then it can take up to a year. It's anywhere between 3 or 4 months up to close to a year.
Okay, and another one here. Is there any funding sources specifically for helping agencies get their evaluations up to standard to have their programs qualify for blueprint standards?
There have been, I know of a couple of situations where there were programs that met our promising standard but didn't meet the model standard. They were able to get funding from private foundations, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, one of those specifically. I know that the OJJDP also had an RFP out some time ago, essentially designed to help those kinds of programs that had some good preliminary evaluation get the additional evaluation that would allow us to certify them as model programs or to be certified on other lists as model programs. So there is, it's not a frequent thing, to be honest. I've only seen it 2 or 3 times. But if you're watching for RFPs coming out of the federal government or out of private foundations, it is possible to get funding to get the additional evaluation evidence you need in order to meet a higher certification standard by blueprints or by crimesolutions.gov or other websites.
Okay, and how about this? How are programs identified? By nomination and literature search? What is it?
2 ways. One is our ongoing consistent literature search. The other is that the program developer or somebody who is aware of a program and thinks it's a great program will write to us and say they would like blueprints to consider that program and giving us at least references to or citations for the evaluations that they know of for that program. When we get that kind of a letter, we do that search. We find those published results or the reports which are available, and that we start the review process. And once we get to the point that it goes to the board, then it'll go pretty quickly, but it may take a little while to go through the earlier part of that review process.
And what's the percentage of programs identified by nomination versus literature search?
I would say that the nomination programs represent not more than 20%.
And which
so
data?
So 80% of the programs we review, we have picked up on our own by watching the reviews in the literature.
And which databases are used for the search, like PsychoInfo or what? Or not PsychoInfo, I'm sorry, PsycInfo?
We use all of those journals which involve any of the targeted outcomes for blueprints. So we're talking probably about 50 or 60 journals.
Okay. And to what extent should communities implementing blueprints programs collect or monitor outcomes data?
Ooh, boy, that's a great question. I don't know that. I don't know, what percent. Once they've adopted that program and are implementing it, one of the things that I think we have argued is that one of the values of promoting high-quality evidence-based programs is that it's no longer necessary for every implementation of that program to go through one of these very expensive and complicated randomized controlled trial evaluations. That's the value of its being an evidence-based program. So we have said that it's not required. If you're implementing one of our model programs, we don't think it's necessary that you always do a high-quality outcome evaluation for that. It is important that we continue to evaluate those programs on some basis, particularly when they are being implemented with a slightly new population or under different kinds of setting or environmental conditions. So anytime there's some adaptation being made to a program's implementation, then it's really critical that we get another evaluation. So given that, I don't think I have any good idea for how often these model programs that are being implemented are undergoing additional outcome evaluations.
Okay, thank you. So that concludes our questions at this time. I'm just going to check really quick and see how it's going for David with his audio.
I wonder how it's going on my audio. Can you hear me?
That sounds so much better.
Okay, well that's good. Now let's see how about the video.
Okay. So Del, is it okay if we turn the time over to David now?
Yes, good idea.
Okay. So David, do you see something popping up on your screen there letting you take over?
Yeah, it says people say, show my screen, let's see if I can get it to happen.
Okay.
My screen is showing here.
Oh yes, I see it.
Does everyone see it?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Yep, I see it.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks. We're going to talk about the essential questions that are addressed by evaluations of blueprint programs at this point, and we'll come back to some of the fatal flaw kinds of questions. I tried to put this with a positive spin instead of a negative spin, and the one thing that I can't see is how I can advance this slide, Jen. Let's see. I see. Let's see if I can. That little thing, that little arrow. That
disappeared.
Little,
yeah.
So it's so much fun. So I can't see that little arrow for knowing how to advance this slide.
You know what? While you look at that, can I have Del? Can I have you answer a couple questions?
Sure.
Okay. So someone would like to know, to what extent should communities implementing blueprints programs collect, monitor outcomes data?
Oh, great question. I think it's critical that they are always involved in what we would call a process evaluation. That is, they set up a data collection system in which they are collecting information on all of those who are coming into the program on their risk and protective factors, and monitoring, how much of the intervention they get, some kind of a dosage kind of assessment, and the situation at the point of exiting that intervention or that program. So looking at fidelity and doing a process evaluation is something which has to be constantly monitored, because there is a tendency over time to lose that attention to fidelity and the careful implementation of the program the way it was designed. What I don't think is required on a routine basis is doing a randomized control trial, where you've got randomization to a control condition and then are getting follow-up data over time. I don't think that's something which should be a routine kind of evaluation requirement.
I'm good, Jen, when needed.
Okay, and we do have one more question. Do you want to take a minute for that, or do you want David to go forward?
Why don't we have David go forward, and then we'll pick up that question later.
Sounds good. Okay, David, you're on.
Okay. So we're going to be talking about what happens when we start reviewing these evaluations of programs in the Blueprints Advisory Board. And we actually have 19 different criteria that we look for. And what we've done today is tried to identify the ones that are the most frequently encountered problems. As we look at evaluations, things that people don't do that we need them to do in order to certify a program as having adequate evaluation quality to be either identified as a promising or model program if it has positive effects. And so the first one is, does the study use an intent to treat analysis? We actually had a question about that. And by that we mean, are all the units, whether they're schools or communities or individuals or families, are all the units that were assigned to condition in the original assignment in the study. Are there attempts made to follow up all those people or all those schools or all those units, whatever the unit is? If not all of them are followed up, if in fact we limit our follow-up to those people who went through at least 10 sessions of a program or who completed the program, then we are in fact not looking at an intent to treat design. And we need to look at an intent to treat design in order to determine what was the effect given the randomization or the initial design. And so what we want to see when it says what to do, what we want to see is that the evaluator attempted to follow up and report on all the units, all the subjects assigned to conditions in the study, not just completers, not just those who received a certain dose of the intervention. We want to know, did we try to follow up all those assigned to the condition, whatever the unit is, whether it's individuals or schools or communities or whatever. So that's our first place where we often see problems of people only following up those people who completed a certain amount or even the full program before they include them in follow-up. And that really introduces the problem of selection effects and other effects that aren't really due to the intervention, but due to people's own motivation to stay involved in the program, etc. Our second essential question that often doesn't get answered in the positive is, does the study clearly describe the sample size at each stage of data collection? Often we'll see something about the initial sample size, or we might see something about the sample that was analyzed, but we don't see all those pieces of information about the N at each stage of the study. We recognize that in studies there are going to be times when we can't follow up everyone, and so the N in the intent to treat initial baseline sample is greater than the N later on. But we want to see all those N's. So what we want to see people doing when they're evaluating programs is to report the number of units or subjects at each stage of the study, including the N at baseline and the N's and percentage of the baseline sample remaining at post-test in each condition, as well as in each follow-up. Del mentioned that we're looking for model programs that have had an effect that lasted for at least 12 months beyond the end of the program. So we would want to know what was the N at the end of the program and also what was the N that was followed up at 6 months or at 12 months or at 10 years. How are we doing with that? Are there any questions at this point about this part, Jen, or shall we go on to number 3?
I do have one question. Does Blueprints use or recognize the distinction between evidence-based and evidence-informed programs? And if so, what is that distinction?
I would say that we don't recognize that distinction because what we're really looking for is what I think people call evidence-based programs. I tend to not even use either of those labels myself anymore because they aren't clear to everyone what they mean. What we're talking about is programs that have been tested and found effective. And we're talking about what had to be done in the test in order for us to have confidence in the finding of effectiveness. When people talk about evidence-informed programs, they may be talking about programs that are based in their design or development on prior research, descriptive research showing a relationship between a risk factor and an outcome, and therefore we want to try to reduce this risk factor to prevent this outcome. But if they haven't tested that hypothesis that addressing this risk factor and changing it will produce a better outcome, then that program will not be included in a Blueprints promising or model program list.
Yeah, the evidence-informed typically does not involve experimental evidence. It's correlational.
Okay, number 3 is the measurement of the outcomes done independently from the delivery of the intervention. When you think about parenting programs, for example, if you involve parents in a parent training program to help them modify their children's oppositional and defiant behavior, the parents are actually part of the intervention. They need to do things differently in the home or in their interaction with their children in order to have the program implemented. If we rely only on parents in that case to report the outcomes for young people, we know that when you're involved in an intervention, you're more likely to hope for success and perhaps see success even if there isn't very much. And so we want to separate the people who are involved in the delivery of the intervention from the people who are reporting on the outcome. Now, clearly, we would like to have reports from parents who were involved in an intervention on what they see in their children. But for blueprints, that's not sufficient as a measurement of outcome. We also want to see other indicators of the improvement after intervention that come from someone separate from the person who is engaged in the intervention. So in the case that we're describing now, we would want to see self-report data from children or reports from other observers, like ratings of children's behaviors by teachers who aren't involved in the intervention. So if the people who are doing the intervention are the only people who are evaluating the effectiveness of the intervention, that program will not make the blueprints list of either promising or model programs. So as you do evaluations of programs, you want to say, can I get an independent rating from someone who wasn't involved in the actual delivery of that intervention? How are we doing with this, Jen? Shall I go on to the next one?
Yep. Go ahead.
Good. Number 4, are outcome measures general enough that they don't depend on the unique content of the intervention? There are some kinds of interventions, for example, people who are teaching refusal skills to young adolescents, and they may have 5 steps of refusal skills. And people might say, did young people learn those refusal skills? If the measure is just that they learned what was taught in the program, but that is not a measure that is a general measure of an outcome of concern to blueprints, those 5 outcomes that Del mentioned earlier, then that's not going to be an adequate measure of outcome for us to have confidence that it's not just a manipulation check or an implementation check. So what we want to see is valid and reliable measures of the outcomes that Blueprints covers. If you have just a study-specific measure that is trying to see, did that content get taught, and that's not a generally accepted indicator of a Blueprints outcome, then we don't see sufficient data to have confidence that the program is, in fact, affecting one of those 5 outcomes that Del identified earlier, and is therefore either promising or model. So as evaluators look at the effectiveness of interventions, we want them to say, okay, let's look at a general acceptable measure of delinquency. Let's look at a general acceptable measure of reading ability in the early elementary grades, if that's what we're looking at, et cetera, so that we can have confidence that using measures that people would accept as indicators of these Blueprints outcomes, that this program has had that effect. I'm going to go on to our next one. Number 5, does the analysis control for baseline outcome measures? If we only follow up people at the end and we don't know where they were at the beginning, then we can't really see what the effect of the program was. And so what we're looking for is for baseline measures of the outcome. Now, if we're talking about delinquency or drug use, and we're talking about starting a preventive intervention in the 1st and 2nd grade, there isn't going to be a baseline measure of the outcome that we can use to see if the prevention intervention actually reduced drug use or delinquency. And so in that case, we're looking for a baseline measure that is some kind of indicator or correlated variable that is correlated with the outcome. For example, we might be looking for any indication of oppositional or defiant behavior at the beginning in the early elementary grade if we're doing an elementary delinquency prevention program that will be ultimately looking at effects on delinquency. So we can look to see is there early aggressive and the aggressive behavior rated by teachers, or any indication of oppositional defiant behavior as rated by parents in the early elementary grades as a surrogate for having baseline measures of delinquency per se in the study. So what we're wanting to do is include a baseline measure of the outcome if that's developmentally appropriate, but if it's not, then we want a baseline measure that's correlated with the outcome, and we want to use those baseline measures in analyses, either as a covariate controlling for where things were at the beginning, or through change score analyses, or looking at group by time interactions where the baseline measure is part of the sequence of time measurements. Jen, are we doing okay with those next two questions?
Yes, you can continue.
Good. Okay. Number 6 is the analysis done at the proper level. What we're looking for now is when we're doing intent to treat analyses, we want to make sure that the units that were assigned to condition are the units that are analyzed. So if we assign individual children to classrooms and schools at the individual condition, assigning individual children, then we could and often do see studies that are analyzed at the individual level. However, if classrooms were assigned to the condition because the intervention is delivered by a teacher in a classroom setting, if the classrooms are assigned to intervention conditions, or if, for example, different schools are assigned to conditions, some schools get it and some schools don't get the intervention, then we need to really think about our analysis at the level of randomization, because that randomization is what led us to believe that those two groups should be similar at the beginning. And it's the level at which the randomization occurred which gives us that confidence, which means that the analysis needs to take that level of assignment into account. Now that can be done because you analyze, if you assign schools to condition, you can analyze at the school level, or what many people often do is do multi-level analyses which account for the nesting of individuals within those schools and account for the interclass correlations, because what we know is when people are in groups that they influence one another, and that influence leads to a greater correlation among the people in that set of units, and that will influence the degree to which we will see effects of the intervention, and therefore we really need to do the analysis with attention to the level of assignment in the beginning. Our next frequently encountered problem is that the study needs to demonstrate a low level of attrition that's unrelated to assignment group, socio-demographic characteristics, and baseline measures of the outcome. Because what we know is, as Del said earlier, that if there is differential attrition from one group or another, that may mean that different kinds of people are left in the two groups or in the three groups that are being compared. Differential attrition is a huge potential threat to the internal validity of a study that allows us to conclude that it was the intervention that made the difference, rather than just different people being in different conditions when we did the follow-up. And this is probably one of the biggest problems that we encounter still today with the evaluations that we review, and that is people often do report about attrition, but they report about that from the overall sample rather than reporting how much attrition occurred within each arm of the study or each condition of the study. And we need to see how many people, what proportion of people were left in each condition in the follow-up studies when we're doing the follow-up at the end of the program, or again at 1 year or 10 years after the intervention. And if there is differential attrition, then we need to understand if what was done, if anything, to deal with that differential attrition from conditions, because it's a very large potential threat to the internal validity of the conclusion that the intervention made a difference, rather than just people who didn't like the intervention dropped out of the follow-up, and therefore all you have left in the study are people who really liked the intervention, were really gung-ho, really did well, and guess what? It looks like they're doing a lot better than the control group, because you lost all the unmotivated and non-responsive people from the intervention condition, making the results look good, but in fact that's not what happened. Any questions about that one, Jen? Are we doing okay on these?
We do have a question in regard to essential question number 3. Would assessments that the participants complete, such as CBCL, qualify for consideration, or does there need to be another separate report to measure outcome that comes from an independent source? And would that include measures such as recidivism or other post-intervention outcomes?
No, we don't. If let's say we're doing an intervention that's changing teaching practices in the classroom to have effects on the behavior of young people in that classroom, it's fine to use the CBCL with the. I'm sorry. If you're talking about using the teacher checklist to evaluate a teacher ratings of the kids, to evaluate a teacher-delivered intervention, then that wouldn't be acceptable by itself. If we also had self-reports from the kids, or independent reports from parents, or from other people who are able to report on the population that we're talking about, that would be adequate. But if the teacher is doing the intervention, and the only data we have are reports from the teacher on the outcomes associated with that intervention, that potential bias that we talked about earlier is still there, and we wouldn't accept that as sufficient information. Del, am I doing okay on that? Do you have any other additions you want to add there?
No, I think that's correct. We are interested in that teacher ratings. I just want to make sure that we understand that it's not that we totally discount that rating, but that we don't allow it to be the only evidence. If that is together with some other independent assessment, then that's really good. That gives us additional information.
And so just to follow up on the second part of the question, if in fact there were data from an independent source on the juvenile court contacts or arrests or something like that, that would clearly be an independent measure that would be useful in this context that we were talking about with this teacher-delivered intervention. So we just have one more of these 8 essential questions. Are effect sizes presented? We do care about the significance of effects, but we need to know what was the size of the effect. How large was the effect? And that means that in addition to reporting statistical significance, we're looking for reports of effect sizes, like Cohen's d. We can look at regression coefficients, we can look at odds ratios, but we're looking for evidence of the size of effects in addition to reporting the statistical significance of effects. So that's the final one of our big fatal flaws that we often run into. Those eight criteria that I just laid out, those 8 questions, are really questions that we run into negative answers much more frequently than we would like to, and we would like to see more and more evaluation studies done where those 8 questions are answered in the affirmative. As I said earlier, they're not the only ones. Obviously, we're looking at the reliability and validity of measures and a number of other things that people do pretty well in reporting consistently. But these 8 items that we've just reviewed are things that we do not see consistently dealt with in the way we need to see them in order to really review and rate programs as positive with regard to either being promising or model programs. So that's my part of the presentation. I think we're close to time. So.
And the questions are pouring in, so I'll give you a couple if that's okay. Okay, in relation to number 7, could you speak to how the blueprints review process takes into account varying intervention effects on different social demographic groups? And what about studies in which demographic differences are not reported?
We really do look at the effects on different demographic groups if they're reported. Some people, some people analyze overall effects of school-based interventions. Some people say were there differential effects for males and for females. Some people say were there differential effects for different racial and ethnic groups. We don't require that, and Del will correct me if I'm wrong about this, but we don't require that subgroup analyses have been done. If there was an intent to treat design and the report is of the overall effects of the intervention in that intent to treat design, we will look at that and take that report and accept it. However, we all are also eager, just as many developers and implementers and policymakers and practitioners are interested in answering the question, is this having similar effects on different subgroups? And so where there are subgroup analyses, we are able to see whether there are differential effects. And in fact, if you look at the blueprints list, you will find that there are some programs that are warranted as promising or model programs for males but not females, or for females and not males, or for a particular ethnic group, but they may not have been tested with other ethnic or racial groups. So although it's not a requirement to look at effects on different subgroups, it is desirable because it allows us all to have greater clarity about the specificity of that intervention effect.
Okay, and another question. Does Blueprints do corrections for baseline equivalence differences or cluster level attrition if the study does not do this?
Could you say it again? Do we?
Sure.
No, we don't. Okay, I think I understand the question. We don't reanalyze data. We, in some cases where there have been there's been no baseline, there's been no report of differential attrition, and the rest of the study looks very good, we may ask the developer or the evaluator to provide us with information about that issue, but we don't reanalyze data. We sometimes ask developers or evaluators to reanalyze data or to do additional analyses in order for us to be able to answer these 8 questions with confidence. But we don't actually do reanalyses for the evaluators.
Okay. I think that is it. We do have multiple requests for your PowerPoint slides if you guys are comfortable with that. You can send them to me and I'll forward them on to the people that were interested. And that pretty much concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for being with us and answering all our questions. There were a lot of questions today, so that was exciting. And next month, make sure all of you join us next month on the 21st of November. That's the 3rd Friday, and that's 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, noon Eastern Standard Time. I know sometimes you guys get a little confused about that. So mark your calendars, and we'll keep you posted on what's up next month. And thank you again for being with us today.